Chapter 10, The Lure of the Tropics. I think seed catalogs are the most exciting things there are, and I think seed companies are the most generous, for they never question your motives when you write for their catalogs. By looking at the return address in the upper left-hand corner of the envelope, they could have seen that I lived in the vicinity of the, quote, most westernly tip of the United States, end quote, and yet they never hedged about sending me gorgeously illustrated catalogs mostly devoted to tropical plants with thrilling pictures of orange trees in full fruit and bloom, lemon trees, magnolias, avocados, peppers, and other brilliantly colored warm-sounding names like canna, Iberian fire lily, Mexican flame flower, African daisy. On gray, soggy November days, I pored over last year's catalogs, and after an hour or two, I can look out at the squishy landscape without shivering, for I can almost hear the hum of bees, feel the summer heat, and see the yard wallowing in tropical glory. When the new catalogs came in the spring, I devoured them, and with pencil and paper made lists, which usually totaled around $279, and had to be slashed and slashed. At last I ordered my seeds and spent days rigid with expectancy. I always bought, against my better judgment, some of the fire flame velt type of plants from a little-known semi-tropical seed company, which invariably substituted nasturtiums for Belgian Congo moon glow blooms, often attaining a size of 2 feet in diameter, California poppies for East Indian pom-poms, and never put in more than 3 seeds to a package. They were not very honest, but I can warm my hands over the pictures in their catalogs. Bob, who had already ordered and received all of his seeds weeks before from a well-known local firm, listened resignedly to my feverish accounts of the front yard exploding with giant cannas, the house crawling with flamethrowers, gourds, and monstrous Congo roses, the fences completely hidden by, quote, unusual annuals, end quote. Then dug a trench with the full length of the vegetable garden, filled it with chicken manure, rich brown earth, and sweet peas. I saw defeat coming as relentlessly as old age. The second spring, Bob made me a cold frame all my own for my tropical galaxy of bloom. It was not exactly a spontaneous idea on Bob's part, and he was pretty tight-lipped as he grimly slammed the nails home, mumbling about the drop of water on stone technique. But it was a beauty, facing south, with 3 sections, sashes on hinges, and little arms to embrace the sashes when I wanted to lift them. When it was finished, all I had to do was to wait for my seeds to come and for the earth to take a slight detour from its ordinary whirl onto its axis, and success would be mine. Meanwhile, it was time to work on the vegetable garden. As we plowed and harrowed and dragged the feathery loam, I thought of New England people and of how they have to build their soil out of humus and sweat, and it made me feel guilty. Our soil was so wonderful that I could thrust my arm clear to the shoulder in it when it was ready to plant. It was a natural sandy loam, and with chicken manure and compost added, it was so fertile it was almost indecent. Bob made garden rows as straight as dies, spaced to the inch, and his seeds came up the correct distance, one from another. When he planted a seed, it immediately got busy and sprouted and appeared in exactly the allotted time. From thenceforward, the progress was about as fascinating and as trustworthy as a postal savings bond. The seed reached full maturity with interest. In exactly the promised number of days, and another good investment was harvested. Bob's garden was a thing of symmetry and beauty. It was bordered with great clumps of rhubarb that had bright red speckled stalks as big as my arm, and so crisp they snapped in two, drippy with juice. Between the rhubarb plants, and nourished by the continual waterings of manure water which we gave the rhubarb, were parsley, chives, basil, thyme, sage, marjoram, anise, and dill. I put parsley in everything but ice cream, Bob said, But even he admitted that tomato sauce, stew, kidney sauté, spaghetti, or meat pie seemed tasteless without fresh basil once you had tasted them cooked with it. Mint grew in a thick hedge by the woodshed, and my great fear was that it might get started somewhere else. It was so eager. In rows about 50 feet long, stretching from the sweet peas to the rhubarb and herbs, were peas, early and late, carrots, turnips, beets, salsify, celery, celery root, lettuce, endive, broccoli, cabbage, cauliflower, Swiss chard, sweet corn, parsnips, beans, cucumbers, tomatoes, squash, radishes, onions, the sweet flat Bermudas, which grew as large as apples and almost as mild, and Brussels sprouts. Over by the Bruder house, at least that year's location of the Bruder house, Bob made an asparagus bed, which I estimated, when in full production, would take care of that portion of the United States extending from the Columbia River to the Pacific Ocean. Our growing season was short, or rather our maturing season was short, for we had late frosts and little hot water. But the mild winters and long cool springs seemed to give a succulency to the vegetables which I have never seen surpassed. Nothing was ever pithy or tough or harsh flavored, and even carrots left in the ground all winter by mistake were crisp and tender the next spring. That was truly a gardener's paradise, except that we couldn't grow lima beans or eggplant or melons or peppers, and we had to mulch our English walnut trees and apricot trees very heavily, and even then the blossoms were often frostbitten. With Bob's gardening so stable, so trustworthy, it didn't seem fair to me that mine should always be the wildcat variety. A great many of my seeds not only did not sprout, but disappeared entirely. The others came up the next morning like Jack's beanstalk, or didn't show up until I had given up hope and planted something else on top of them. And then they all appeared together and created confusion and ill will. My seeds, no matter in what order they were put into the ground, always came up in bunches. A big clump here, nothing at all here for quite a way, now a little wizened group, a single plant, and another huge clump. Also, my plants were usually not healthy, and I'm sure that I have introduced more varieties of plant disease than anyone in the Northern Hemisphere. I planted nasturtiums and bachelor's buttons, and they came up covered with South African jungle rot and Himalayan spotwort. I decided at last that instead of the green thumb, I had the touch of death, that I was never destined to be a second Mowgli or a little shepherd of the hills, because I hated little wild things and they hated me. Bob, on the other hand, had nature by the scruff of the neck, and his sweet peas had blooms like gladiolus and stems about 10 feet long. The man from whom we bought our bulbs gave me all of his lovely single dahlia tubers and kept only the hydrocephaloid monsters in liverish lavender and virulent pink. He said, quote, "You ought to get you another hobby. There is some folks who just don't have the feeling. Yep, you should get you another hobby," end quote.